In this segment, I wanted to discuss the idea that the UK is kind of trying to negotiate with this kind of deal the EU are offering or did offer around kind of visa access for the under 30s. So the move could allow EU nationals under the age of 30 being allowed to live and work in the UK for up to 3 years with a reciprocal agreement for UK citizens. So this was a deal rejected by the Conservatives earlier on in the year, and rejected by Labour, and this again has been rejected by Labour. These are anonymous briefings, so we'll discuss kind of the origin of the kind of proposal, along with other things. So one of the sources is saying no one will say it publicly, but at this stage there is an acknowledgement that this is an area where we will need to move. If we are serious about resetting relations with the EU, then we need to be prepared to give them some of the things that they want. Another source said that while the government had not proposed any plans for a youth mobility scheme, they were prepared to listen to what the EU had to say on the issue. They said, returning of freedom of movement is a red line for the government, which we've heard consistently. And when asked specifically about the scheme, one of the kind of junior ministers, I think she is, kept playing coy and said she didn't know much about it.
Is there a discussion being had, and would you think it a fair thing to do to allow under 30s from the EU to come and work and study in the UK as part of a reciprocal freedom of movement for young people with the EU?
So I'm not aware of any plans. I know that, we're really keen to reset our relationship with our nearest neighbours.
Why?
And so she does this around 8 times. I'm not going to bore you with this. You can just read it you can find it in the description if you want. But 8 times, since the story came out, it's a bit weird that, you had the original thing, Politics UK, they kind of just quote tweet stories saying originally new ministers are preparing to allow freedom of movement for under 30s within the EU, and then that was debunked by a newer article from the FT in the period of the same day, which is crazy, the speed, within hours really, saying a government spokesperson saying we are not considering an EU-wide youth mobility scheme and there'll be no return to freedom of movement, which we've just covered. Oops, there's an ad for the thing. And so when we look at the kind of the history of the agreement, I guess it came out this year. The reason why the EU offered this is because the offer came out of the blue. So this offer from the EU, it was an attempt by the European Commission to quash a bid by the UK to do unilateral deals with 6 countries, including France, Spain, and Germany. The French in particular were adamant that the UK should not be allowed to cherry pick EU access post Brexit. So this is the origin of the deal. The idea that the EU really want this deal to happen, etc., for cultural reasons, historic reasons, they may do so, as kind of the person we're going to mention points out in their video. But overall, I don't think it's that big a deal for the EU. They don't really care about this that much. So the idea that the UK can use this as a bargaining chip is complete garbage. In my opinion. Another apparent obstacle is the EU kind of wants EU university students to have home fee status even, at each other's universities for 4 years. So that would mean that EU students will be paying kind of the lower UK fees, rather than paying the international rate, which is something the universities don't actually want. Even though universities made decent money from the Erasmus scheme, clearly they do not want this to happen, so they'll be lobbying the government against this kind of agreement. So the benefits for the EU are very minimal. And just looking at things like, EU unemployment in certain countries, look at the Netherlands, it's at 3.6. Different countries use different metrics, of course. Germany is around 5.9%. And the UK is around 4.2%. So, how keen would these countries be to give the UK a kind of agreement? And, the benefits are that, you do get more kind of cultural engagement between two different communities, two different countries. When you go visit them, it kind of destroys some preconceived notions people have when you go and actually meet people. You find, I think, the most racist people are the ones that don't really meet people from different countries, the ones that have only really heard stories about them, and that's where they get their kind of beliefs from. And I think one of the main reasons the UK actually wanted this is because of au pairs, kind of nannies. I think we'd call them in the UK. I'm not 100% sure translation. It's a French word. But they do discuss that au pairs typically cut more remote areas of countries such as Germany, France, Spain, and the UK. Now, where did we hear those countries be mentioned before? It was here: France, Spain, and Germany, just in a different order. and you got this person talking about how much they benefited, from having an au pair, and the different countries they came from, etc. But some people, like this gentleman here, Thomas, a waste engineer in his 20s, clearly not really a fan of this scheme, is worried about immigration, and then you had a third person here saying that they're kind of annoyed that Labour haven't taken the EU up on this kind of scheme. Her saying, I've voted Labour all my life and I keep having to persuade myself that Starmer is playing the long game. Where have we heard that before? People constantly saying Starmer's playing the long game, he knows what he's doing, trust the process, etc. Those sorts of people clearly have no idea what's going on, and we're going to be discussing one of those sorts of people right now. So let's skip to their video.
And this week, an article in the Times has said they've been told by sources in the government that they'll probably...
So bear in mind, I've looked at the articles, the exact articles he's looked at, and I don't get how his takes are kind of wildly different to mine, unless I've read it a very wrong way, he's read it more of a correct way, or we have different biases really acting out here. I don't know.
Have to give ground on this youth mobility issue in order to get their reset of relations with the EU. In other words, assuming this report is accurate, what the government are very quietly saying is, yeah, youth mobility scheme, yeah, it's not something we're really that bothered about. But, if it helps us get something we are really bothered about, we're not totally opposed to it, right?
And so, this argument, we can use it as some sort of negotiating chip when we can see why the EU offered this scheme. The EU offered this scheme because the UK kept cherry picking. That's why. The UK tried to cherry pick which countries would have this kind of access, just like the UK tried to get a very specific deal with France over returns, and then France said, you got to go through the EU, even though the EU said you can negotiate a deal with France. France being very clear on this, the second time over two different issues really that France have said stop trying to cherry pick. So it's very interesting that he hasn't mentioned the context of this agreement in the first place.
So it's basically going to happen. It was always going to happen. It's really just a case of Labour getting something in return for a scheme that would be as much use to us as the EU. In fact, I would personally argue that although the EU are the ones really pushing this, the scheme would be of more use to Britain than the EU, I think. Because I think what we have here is something, it goes on the EU pile of wants that we pretend to not be bothered about, concede ground on, but actually does a lot of good, economically as well as socially. It will mean from the EU's point of view, it's the social benefits they're interested in, that sort of, cross-cultural sharing. But for us, there's huge economic benefit, getting access to those young casual workers from Europe again. Something that, I suppose...
we've had a record levels of vacancies in the areas where, casual workers would have filled in hospitality, etc. So, the benefits for the UK are tremendous. But obviously the EU knows that.
But also the hospitality industry is badly missed. Now, obviously, if I see it that way, I'm sure the EU Commission do as well. I don't think this is a cunning ruse on Labour's part as such. I can't imagine we're going to leverage major concessions. I don't think, for example, that us pretending to concede on this gets us the veterinary agreement, right? But nonetheless, we're getting a picture of precisely the trajectory I talked about, that what Labour really wants is anything that lowers trade barriers. They see the veterinary deal as an example of something that would lower trade barriers, but is more urgent for us than the EU. And also the veterinary deal kills two birds with one stone. First of all, and it's not talked about enough, it massively dials down the visible signs of Brexit division between Britain and Northern Ireland.
One of the other problems is when it comes to the veterinary agreement, what specifically, what's he talking about? Because from what I've read, the Labour government, these from stories that are a bit older, a few months ago, which is they wanted equivalency whilst the EU want dynamic alignment. And so, when you're talking about a veterinary agreement, what specifically are you talking about? Because these are two very different things here.
Dials down those political tensions. That's something that you could sort of say to the EU as well, because they're as interested as anyone else in making sure that you don't have a lot of divisions within Northern Irish politics on the issue. But secondly, it won't abolish the need for, say, standards paperwork or controls as such, because we'll still be outside the single market. But the aim would be to reduce the number of checks at trade borders, which would help a lot. That's what Labour want as a priority. And it's not something the EU have as a priority. So everything else they're going to do will be with that in mind. So yeah, Labour are obviously going to sound a little hesitant to back anything that the EU seems very, very excited about.
I don't think the EU are very excited about this scheme at all. I don't think the EU are like, oh, you know what, guys, we've got this tremendous scheme. The whole idea was to stop cherry picking. That was the point of it. No, I don't think it's a scheme where they're like, oh my god, guys, we've really got to get the UK involved in this. It's predominantly there to stop cherry picking. So I genuinely I don't get what he's, you know, this kind of idea that you really want this and they're, you know, we can use this to compromise. It doesn't make sense when you, especially when you read, you know, more than one article and you just don't go off leaks, etc. When you look at the perspective from both sides here, which is, you know, the EU are also competing for a labour force as well. They also have things like low unemployment. They will still be competing for, you know, kind of seasonal workers, casual workers, etc. So this it's bizarre, honestly. It just doesn't make sense to kind of use this point to argue, oh, you know, this is going to happen, and now it's even better because now we can use this to leverage other kinds of negotiations which will benefit the UK. I'm just not seeing it, guys. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. You know, I'll take the L on some of this stuff because I'd like the UK to get deals in certain areas. I'll happily take the L on it, but I need to see the logic. I need to see the logic here.
I fail to see the logic here. The price to pay for power.
So that's what I'm saying to you guys, because, you know, we can say on this stuff, you could cite Armstrong.
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
But I don't know.
Because it wants to turn it into, say, oh, well, this is something the EU want. Yeah, we're not that bothered. But, oh, if you would say, oh, okay, we're not opposed to it either. You know, turn it into a concession on our part in return for something else. But there was no way a Labour government were ever going to actually block a youth mobility scheme.
Especially when, you know, you got the Labour government saying that they're going to reduce net immigration. I'd assume the ones that counted in these visas, even though the temporary visas, would be classed into net immigration until they go. I'm just not seeing, like, Labour being that pro for it, I'll be honest, on multiple levels here. Especially when they're always very clear, this is not a return of freedom of movement. We don't want freedom of movement. You know, you got people who are idiots and racists who say, oh, you know, they're trying to take us back in and blah, 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 and cause a big problem for the Labour government when they don't have the comms teams to really counter or really back up a lot of the stuff that they're trying to push. So I'm not seeing it.
That makes no sense. Absolutely no sense. It was crazy enough that the Conservatives did, but you could sort of get from their sort of politics how they could paint themselves into that corner. Labour government, they've got absolutely no hang-ups that would require them to block something like this. Makes no...
Again, with the immigration stuff, I mean, you know, the people who see EU workers as competition, etc., people who push the myth of EU workers depressed massively wages for people in Britain, you know, people will make that argument again, and if Labour aren't strong enough to counter those arguments, they'll crumble on this specific thing, just like we've seen them crumble before when it came to migrants' rights, EU worker rights, you know, EU, you know, the rights for EU citizens, etc. We've seen them crumble on that, you know, votes for EU citizens. Like this idea that the Labour government will just inherently do these pro-EU moves or pro kind of European moves, it's complete garbage to me, I'll be honest.
No sense. And although I don't want to put too much, I mean, this is a single article in the Times quoting unnamed government sources, and we don't know what those government sources are.
I appreciate that. He mentions that at the end of the article, rather at the end of the video, rather than really at the beginning, where it would have been more important to mention it.
I'm going to tell you, this is going to happen. It was always going to happen like this. You know, it's absolutely, this is my I told you so. It's I told you so is going to be a hell of a lot.
You told us what, bruv? You've told us what? They've rejected the same scheme. Again, like, this idea you've told us, you've shown us nothing. I don't get it. Like, you haven't proved anything. All they've done is reject the scheme. You're trying to argue they're using it as a negotiation point. At that point, you can argue, oh, I told you so. I got it right. At that point, you can smoke the pack. You can light it up. That's the point you can do that. Before that moment, you can't. You can't. Because you haven't proved anything. If anything, I've been proved right. Because I didn't think they would go for this scheme. And lo and behold, they haven't gone for this scheme. I don't get it. And when it comes to stuff like this, and we'll be discussing another person in a different video, another pro-Labour person, they're happy to sit back.
And those that'll follow them. We don't just sit back and hope for the best. We'll make the best happen.
You know, you've got to take a leaf out of Russell Adler's book, which is, we don't sit back and hope for the best. We make the best happen. You know, fair enough, he's part of pressure groups and whatever within Labour, but unless, in my opinion, there's real there's a real likelihood that Labour will collapse in the next election without people kind of voting for Labour still, as in like people, you know, really holding firm and saying, "Oh, we'll vote for Labour regardless." If there's outside electoral pressure from like the Greens, for example, that's the only way you're going to get these kind of policies that you want. Because ultimately, if Labour know you're going to keep voting for them, they don't care about these policies. Because all they'll say is, well, it's better than what you had before, and you'll get certain commentators will say, oh, well, you know, it's better than it was under the Conservatives, we need to keep voting Labour to get these things, to keep putting pressure on them, we need to join this group in Labour and that group in Labour, you know, and in reality, I don't know how many times I have to say it, I don't think they care. I really don't think they care, like the Labour leadership, unless there's electoral consequences. I can't see it. You know, off the back of us having, you know, off the back of England seeing massive riots over things like immigration, do you really think the UK, or do you really think the Labour government are going to want to kind of get these kind of deals that are more kind of pro-migration? I don't think they're going to do that, I'll be honest. I could be wrong. I'll take the L if I'm wrong. If this is some 4D chess play that, you know, I just couldn't see the moves or I couldn't see the logic, the genius of it, then fair enough. But for now, I'm not seeing it. And if we look at the facts, Labour rejected the EU mobility scheme back earlier on in the year. If we look at the facts, the UK have seemingly rejected that scheme again and briefed against these leaks. And those are the facts of the situation. I'm not seeing it. But anyways, let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Support the channel on Patreon if you can. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one.